It began, as many mysteries do, with a question. What if the history we've been taught isn't the full story? What if pieces of our collective past, fragments of knowledge, forgotten sciences, or distant voices, had been hidden, lost, or quietly silenced? In dusty libraries, in locked vaults beneath cathedrals, in the frost-bitten pages of explorer logs, whispers of an alternate past persist. Not louder than the accepted record, but deeper, like echoes reverberating through the cracks of time. Stories of manuscripts written in undeciphered tongues, kings who ruled for millennia, pyramids that predate memory, and scrolls describing the stars with precision impossible for their era. We live in an age that trusts documentation, evidence, science. Yet scattered throughout history are records that defy all three, texts that should not exist, knowledge that seems to leap centuries ahead of its time. And each time such a record surfaces, it is met not with celebration, but with resistance. Why? This journey isn't about conspiracy, nor about rewriting the past with fantasy. It is about asking what happens when evidence does not fit the model, when discoveries contradict the linear progression of human development we've so carefully charted. It is about considering that the past might be far stranger and more profound than we allow ourselves to believe. In the following chapters, we will visit 10 such accounts, not to claim absolute truths, but to listen. We will follow the quiet trail of suppressed manuscripts and forbidden scrolls, of ancient architects and astronomers whose tools and timelines do not belong. We will step into the lost corridors of forgotten pyramids, decipher astronomical codes in ancient codices, and examine the diaries of explorers who claim to find civilizations buried beneath the ice. Each chapter begins not with answers, but with images, a page, a stone, a star. From there, we trace a thread, what it tells us, what it might mean, and why it was hidden. In the end, this story is not just about history. It is about human curiosity, the longing to understand not only where we are going, but where we came from. And in doing so, perhaps we uncover not just forgotten civilizations, but something deeper, the shape of our collective memory, and the fragile architecture of truth. So let us begin, not with certainty, but with wonder. It started with a book that no one could read. In 1912, Wilfred Voynich, an antiquarian bookseller, purchased a bundle of ancient manuscripts from a Jesuit college near Rome. Among them was a single volume unlike anything else, 240 vellum pages filled with unknown script, baffling botanical drawings, and technical illustrations that shouldn't exist. The Voynich Manuscript defies classification. Written in an undeciphered language, it is filled with plants no botanist can identify, stars arranged in ways no astronomer can explain, and machines that resemble flying craft, centuries before such concepts entered the realm of science. Carbon dating places the vellum in the early 1400s. The ink and binding are consistent with medieval European techniques. But the content? That's another matter. Illustrations show aircraft-like designs with detailed engines and control systems. Anatomical drawings depict biological structures that would require microscopes to observe, centuries before microscopy existed. Pharmacological notes describe chemical compounds and treatments so advanced they align with modern medicine, including precise dosages and formulas. Cryptographers, from Wubby-Bubba-Wook codebreakers to modern AI, have tried and failed to crack the language. Some believe it's a cipher. Others think it might represent an entirely lost form of symbolic communication, a language built for describing science in ways we still don't understand. The scientific community, faced with such an anomaly, has largely chosen to dismiss it. They call the manuscript a hoax, a curiosity, or the fever dream of a bored monk. But that doesn't explain how diagrams in a 15th century book could anticipate 20th century flight physics or chemical structures unknown at the time. Why the resistance? Perhaps because accepting its authenticity would mean acknowledging a hidden current of knowledge, one that flowed parallel to accepted history, and was forgotten or deliberately buried. Today, the manuscript resides at Yale University's Beinecke Library, but access to high-resolution imagery, especially of the more technical illustrations, remains restricted. Scholars are permitted to study its language, but the implications of its diagrams often quietly ignored. And yet, the manuscript endures, a puzzle from the past that refuses to be solved or silenced. What if it's not a code to be cracked, but a message to be heard? Not from a lost alien civilization, but from our own forgotten ancestors. What kind of mind conceived these pages, and what else did they know that we no longer do? In a world that values what can be verified, the Voynich Manuscript challenges us with a different truth, that some knowledge survives not in clarity, but in mystery. Beneath the sands of Iraq, etched into clay thousands of years ago, lies a list that shouldn't exist. The Sumerian King List, unearthed in the early 20th century, records the reigns of Mesopotamian rulers, not just for decades or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. Some reigns stretch beyond 40,000 years, predating all accepted timelines of civilization. To mainstream archaeology, it reads like myth, but the names, cities, and events it details align with independently verified historical sources. Two timelines divide the list: before the Great Flood and after. In the pre-flood era, rulers lived impossibly long lives and presided over achievements that should have been technologically unthinkable: urban planning, metallurgy, advanced astronomy. After the flood, lifespans shortened, civilizations reset. This dichotomy raises a question older than writing itself. Were these just stories? Or are they distant echoes of something real? A memory of a world before catastrophe? Mathematical patterns embedded in the reign lengths suggest something more than legend. Many numbers correspond with astronomical cycles, solar years, lunar phases, planetary alignments. The consistency across multiple clay tablets found in different cities, in different centuries, suggests deliberate record-keeping rather than mythological invention. Yet, academic institutions routinely relegate the King List to the realm of allegory. Museums display it as a curiosity of early mythology. Its implications, that human civilization may have flourished long before our current historical framework allows, are seldom explored. And still, it lingers, a relic not just of governance, but of forgotten chronology. What might we make of a society that tracked time over tens of thousands of years? Who recorded not just events, but entire cycles of civilization, of rise and fall, of memory and amnesia? And if such civilizations did exist, where are their cities, their artifacts, their stories? Maybe they're beneath us in layers we haven't yet uncovered. Or maybe, like the King List itself, their truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to stop seeing myth and start recognizing memory. In a world obsessed with progress, the King List turns our gaze backwards and asks, what if the future we strive toward is only the faint echo of a past we've already lost? It was in the skies over China, not Egypt, where the tallest pyramids on Earth were first recorded. In 1947, U.S. Army Colonel Maurice Sheehan took aerial photographs of vast geometric structures in central China, monuments so massive that when measured, they dwarfed even the Great Pyramid of Giza. Their existence wasn't unknown. Ancient Chinese texts had described them in detail. Built by sky people using technology that made stones weightless. These pyramids were not merely tombs. According to imperial records, they were landing platforms, constructed using methods lost to time, involving levitation and gravitational manipulation. The descriptions sound impossible, but the photographs, satellite imagery, and geological surveys suggest something real. Immense, engineered mounds with precise orientation and symmetry. In multiple dynastic eras, Chinese historians wrote of metallic dragons that flew without wings, of floating machines that rumbled like thunder, and of beings from the sky who shared tools of immense power. They linked these accounts to the pyramids, describing them as sacred, ancient even in their own distant past. And yet, access to these structures has been severely restricted. The Chinese government declared many of the pyramids to be natural hills, forbidding excavation and denying foreign researchers entry. Some pyramids have been covered with trees and vegetation, camouflaged from view. But from above, their geometry tells another story. Stones weighing hundreds of tons are fitted with millimeter precision. The orientation of their faces aligns with cardinal directions and solstices. The scale of construction, the mathematical accuracy, it all points to engineering capabilities that surpass what is attributed to early Chinese civilization. So why hide them? Perhaps because acknowledging their true age and nature would force a rewrite of human history, one that includes technology we cannot replicate even now. One that suggests a pre-Chinese civilization, or contact with something, or someone, possessing knowledge far beyond ancient Earth. As satellite imaging continues to improve, the outlines of these pyramids grow harder to ignore. And yet, their story remains buried under bureaucracy, policy, and skepticism. Maybe that's the point. Some truths aren't erased. They're simply reclassified, hidden in the open, labeled as fiction when they speak too loudly. The Chinese pyramids challenge not just archaeology, but the idea that history is linear. They suggest something older, cyclical, even celestial. And they leave us with a haunting question. What kind of civilization builds a monument meant to be seen from the sky and then disappears without a trace? It began with stars and a book that knew them too well. The Madrid Codex, one of only 4 surviving Mayan codices, contains a map of the cosmos that rivals modern astronomy. Written centuries ago, it predicts eclipses, planetary alignments, and celestial events with a precision that baffles historians. Long before telescopes, it traced the heavens with accuracy thought impossible for its time. Within its fragile pages are calculations of orbital cycles, diagrams of the planets, and mechanical devices, analog computers it seems, designed to track celestial movements. The Maya, often reduced in textbooks to calendar makers or builders of stone cities, emerge here as sophisticated astronomers, engineers, and mathematicians. Their numbers told stories. They understood zero before Europe did. They used base 20 positional systems, tracked Venus and Mars with uncanny accuracy, and designed calendars that spanned millennia, synchronized with cosmic rhythms we only recently began to quantify. The Codex goes further still. It includes navigational guides, not for land, but for sea. Instructions for using stars to traverse oceans, suggesting transoceanic travel long before Columbus set sail. It speaks of knowledge inherited, not invented, records of even older civilizations from which the Maya drew their sky lore and science. And yet, when this knowledge was discovered, it was nearly extinguished. The Spanish conquest did not just claim land, it declared war on knowledge. Thousands of Mayan books were burned, labeled heretical. Only 4 survived. The rest, mathematical treatises, star charts, medical encyclopedias, turned to ash under colonial fire. The Madrid Codex is a remnant, a whisper of what once was. Today, access to the Codex is limited. Researchers are permitted to examine its artwork, its symbols, but inquiries into its astronomical or mechanical implications are often brushed aside. Academic focus centers on cultural interpretation, not technological substance. Why? Perhaps because accepting its depth means reassessing not only Mayan civilization, but the entire story of the Americas. It suggests that science didn't come solely from Europe, that deep understanding of the cosmos was already alive, encoded in bark paper books and carved into stone temples. And perhaps it also hints at something older, a lineage of knowledge stretching back beyond the Maya to vanished peoples whose names we no longer remember, but whose mathematics lives on in ink and star. What happens when the past knows more than the present will admit? Maybe the Codex isn't just a record of the stars. Maybe it's a reminder that human potential is not a straight line, but a spiral. And somewhere in that spiral, we've been here before. In the silent moments after his death in 1943, Nikola Tesla's hotel room was sealed and his legacy rewritten. What the world remembers is a genius of alternating current, the man who lit cities and dreamed of wireless energy. What we forget, or were never told, is what the FBI found in that room. Stacks of notebooks filled with diagrams, formulas, and concepts that didn't just anticipate the future, they surpassed it. These were not theoretical musings. They were records of experiments, wireless power transmitted across miles, anti-gravity propulsion, communications not just across continents, but across worlds. Tesla claimed to have received signals, intelligent pattern transmissions, from elsewhere. To some, it sounded like madness. But his notes tell a different story. Tesla had discovered principles of resonant energy transfer that, if true, could power the world without wires or fuel. He spoke of tapping the Earth's own electromagnetic field, a planetary system of energy waiting to be harnessed. He built devices that levitated, spun with no visible source, or emitted energy beams that could disrupt electronics and propulsion systems. His notes describe these technologies in meticulous detail: coil configurations, frequency modulation, energy densities. To an untrained eye, it was science fiction. To physicists, if they dared to look, it was revolutionary engineering. But we don't hear about that Tesla. We hear about the dreamer who failed, the eccentric who faded into obscurity. Why? Because shortly after his death, U.S. intelligence agents seized every document. The Office of Alien Property, an ironic name given the content, took possession of his files, classified them, distributed them to military contractors, and silenced any discussion of the rest of Tesla's work. Some technologies, it seems, are too powerful to be shared. Over the decades, researchers have tried to access those records through the Freedom of Information Act. Most requests are denied. The few pages released are heavily redacted. What little remains hints at devices that could challenge entire industries: energy, transportation, defense. And so the narrative was shaped. Tesla, the genius who went too far. Safer as a myth than a reality. But his papers still exist, locked in archives, labeled under national security. And the ideas they contain, wireless power grids, field propulsion, scalar energy, continue to echo in secret research labs and whispered patents. What if the future we dream of already existed in the past, and we buried it out of fear? Tesla once said, "The present is theirs, the future, for which I really worked, is mine." But maybe that future was taken, not by time, but by silence. In the arid caves near Qumran, beneath centuries of dust and stone, lay scrolls that would unsettle the pillars of theology and history alike. Between 1947 and 1956, archaeologists uncovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, thousands of fragments from ancient Jewish texts, some over 2,000 years old. Most told of law, scripture, and religious life. But a few whispered of something far more enigmatic: advanced knowledge, forgotten science, and accounts that challenged not only religion, but the very timeline of civilization. Among them was a copper scroll etched not on parchment, but on metal, detailing hidden treasures, yes, but also containing precise instructions, chemical formulas, and descriptions of tools and materials far beyond what was thought possible in that era. Other scrolls described celestial movements with uncanny precision. Planetary orbits, eclipse cycles, and stellar alignments, tracked with mathematical elegance. These weren't vague prophecies or poetic allegories. They were technical, specific, scientific. There were texts recounting the Watchers, beings not entirely human, who brought knowledge of metallurgy, medicine, and astronomy to early communities. These accounts echoed older traditions from Mesopotamia and Egypt, where divine intermediaries were said to teach humanity the secrets of civilization. Then there were scrolls that told a different history, timelines that diverged from biblical canon, events unrecorded in accepted chronologies, stories of alternative origins, forgotten rulers, and ancient cities never mentioned in sacred texts. And yet, the most controversial scrolls were the ones withheld the longest. For decades, access to many of the documents was tightly controlled. A small group of scholars held exclusive rights to their study. Translations were delayed. Certain texts were never released in full. Why? Because some scrolls threatened to destabilize more than Scripture. They hinted at a lineage of knowledge, technological, astronomical, even philosophical, that didn't align with the accepted narrative of a humble, pre-scientific ancient world. They describe machines, measurements, laws of nature. They suggested that ancient people understood principles that would not be formalized until thousands of years later. Modern researchers have quietly confirmed the presence of such material, but publishing on these topics remains fraught. Institutions favor theological interpretations. Scientific implications are politely ignored. What is left is a paradox. Ancient scrolls filled with advanced insight, discovered at the crossroads of three great religions and held in the silence of modern institutions. What do we do when ancient truths collide with modern comfort? When sacred texts reveal secrets not of divinity but of design? Perhaps the Dead Sea Scrolls are not just remnants of a lost sect, but fragments of a lost world, a world where knowledge, once shared, became dangerous. And so, it was hidden, not by time, but by choice. The coldest place on Earth holds one of its warmest secrets. In 1947, Admiral Richard Byrd led a U.S. Navy expedition to Antarctica, a mission called Operation High Jump. Officially, it was about military training and scientific research. Unofficially, Byrd's own diary told a far stranger tale. According to his private account, Byrd's aircraft flew beyond the known boundaries of the ice. What he saw defied explanation. Lush valleys, ice-free lakes, and cities glowing beneath translucent domes. He claimed to have encountered a civilization, human in form, but far advanced in technology. They piloted craft that levitated without wings, powered by energy sources unknown to the surface world. They called themselves guardians of the earth, observers, custodians of knowledge long forgotten above the ice. Byrd described vast underground systems, tunnels, structures, even transportation lines that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the Antarctic crust. He noted temperatures that didn't match the expected climate, as if the environment itself were controlled. But when he returned, his story changed. His diary was seized. His public statements were vague. The expedition's official report made no mention of cities or encounters or anything beyond the ordinary. Soon after, Antarctica was declared a zone of international scientific cooperation, but deep exploration, strictly limited. Certain regions, especially those Byrd noted in his log, became off-limits, hidden beneath layers of classification and treaty law. Why was a continent of ice so carefully protected? In the decades since, satellite imagery has hinted at geometric anomalies beneath the ice. Radar scans have revealed vast subterranean caverns. Whistleblowers have spoken of underground bases, of discoveries made and buried again. Yet Byrd's story remains officially dismissed, a fantasy, a confusion, a delusion born of isolation. Still, his credentials are hard to ignore. A decorated pilot, a seasoned explorer, a man entrusted with vast missions and national secrets. Why invent such a tale, unless it wasn't invention at all? If Byrd's account is even partially true, it suggests that civilization is not only older than we think, it may still be with us, hidden in the most remote corners of the earth. A parallel development, a branch of humanity, or something else, that survived, adapted, and built where no one was watching. The ice has always been a symbol of permanence, of what is buried and preserved, but maybe in Antarctica, it doesn't just preserve the past. It conceals a present we've yet to acknowledge. What if the last frontier isn't in the stars above, but beneath our feet, frozen in time and quietly waiting to be rediscovered? In the heart of ancient Egypt, buried beneath the familiar grandeur of temples and tombs, lay a story rarely told, not of pharaohs or gods, but of a forgotten civilization across the sea. In the 19th century, explorers and archaeologists uncovered temple records unlike any others. Within them were scrolls and inscriptions that described diplomatic relations, trade routes, and technological exchanges with a place the Egyptians called Atlantis. These weren't myths, they were technical logs, complete with geographic coordinates, construction diagrams, and records of knowledge exchanges. According to these texts, the Atlanteans shared with Egypt a wealth of scientific understanding, energy manipulation, gravitational engineering, even early forms of flight. Their ships, the records claim, could cross oceans in days. Their buildings defied gravity. Their society, complex and deeply philosophical, emphasized the unity of consciousness and matter, ideas that only now are re-emerging in cutting-edge science. The geographical data is perhaps most astonishing. The maps included land masses that don't appear on any modern globe, but when compared to underwater topography, they align eerily with what now lies beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The Egyptian records described Atlantis as ancient even to them, destroyed in a cataclysm that reshaped continents and rewrote the face of the world. The survivors, they say, fled to distant lands, seeding knowledge where they went. Egypt was one of those lands, but when these records were brought to Europe, they were dismissed. Mythological, scholars said. Symbolic. Museums locked the scrolls away. Only fragments were ever displayed. The parts that referenced energy systems, aerial transport, and consciousness technologies were quietly excluded from study. Egyptian authorities, wary of colonial theft and academic ridicule, restricted access to the sites where such texts were found. International institutions, uncomfortable with their implications, chose safer narratives. Still, the Atlantean story lingers, not in fantasy, but in fragments, in seafloor anomalies, in oral traditions that span continents, in megalithic architecture that defies explanation, and in the technical details of those temple records, coordinates, equations, and principles waiting to be read anew. What if Atlantis wasn't a myth, but a memory? Not a single island, but a network of civilizations lost to time. And if such a network once existed, what does that mean for the linear story of civilization we've come to accept? Perhaps the age of great beginnings lies not ahead of us, but far behind, sunken, scattered, and half-remembered in the temples of those who tried to preserve what they could. Sometimes it's not the absence of evidence that hides the truth. It's our refusal to look at what we already have and to ask what it means. High in the Andes, where stone cities cling to cliffs and stars seem within reach, the Inca told stories not just of gods and empires, but of knowledge handed down from worlds before theirs. Spanish chroniclers in their conquest-era writings recorded more than military victories. They wrote of Inca priests who spoke of inherited sciences, astronomy, metallurgy, architecture, passed to them by earlier civilizations. Civilizations that had calculated the heavens, crossed oceans, and even reached for the stars. In their archives, the Incas kept records, calendars that spanned hundreds of thousands of years, mechanical devices that functioned as celestial calculators, and tools of surgical precision. Chroniclers described cylindrical computing devices, advanced navigational tools, and observations of celestial bodies that required technologies Europe wouldn't develop for centuries. One record spoke of spacefaring ancestors, beings who charted lunar cycles from orbit and mapped cosmic alignments with instruments lost to time. These weren't mythic gods. They were remembered as people, ancestors with knowledge that the Incas revered but could no longer replicate. Their architecture echoed that legacy. Stone blocks fitted with precision that rivals laser cutting. Seams so tight not even a blade of grass could pass through. Earthquake-resistant engineering that modern architects still marvel at. These weren't rough approximations. They were intentional, advanced, and enduring. But when Spanish conquistadors found the Inca libraries, they didn't study them. They destroyed them. Anything that contradicted church cosmology, anything that hinted at non-Christian origins of knowledge, was labeled heresy and reduced to ash. Only fragments survived, carved into stone, hidden in oral traditions, or buried beneath centuries of silence. Today, many of those records remain restricted. Cultural protection laws, while preserving sacred sites, often prevent deep technological study. Academics favor anthropological interpretations, focusing on ritual and symbolism while ignoring engineering and science. But the evidence is there, in plain sight. Instruments without names, patterns without explanations, data without context. What if the Incas were not the originators, but the inheritors of something older? A torch passed from a civilization now lost, or scattered, or remembered only in stories of gods from the stars. And if so, how many times has human knowledge bloomed only to be buried again? The mountains remember. In their stones, their alignments, their silence. And the sky the Incas once mapped. It still turns, waiting for someone to read its patterns again. It was never meant to be found. Tucked away in the Vatican's secret archives, a vast subterranean library said to house over 50 miles of shelving, are documents few have ever seen. But in the 1990s, a series of leaks changed that. Smuggled photographs, transcribed pages, a glimpse into a hidden history meticulously recorded and then locked away. Among the revelations were medieval manuscripts describing technologies centuries ahead of their time, flying machines, energy weapons, and descriptions of sky people bearing luminous knowledge. These accounts weren't metaphorical. They read like engineering logs, diplomatic correspondence, and Inquisition records, documenting interactions with beings of strange origin and great intellect. One letter, attributed to a 13th century pope, detailed an encounter with emissaries not of this earth, who demonstrated devices that manipulated gravity and communicated across great distances without wires or sound. The response? The knowledge was declared heretical, too dangerous, too destabilizing. Other documents told of inquisitions targeting individuals who claimed to possess advanced scientific insight. These weren't mere heretics. They were engineers, astronomers, inventors. Their crime, knowing too much, too soon. Church scholars recorded these details not to share them, but to contain them, to study and store them in a place where only the trusted few would ever look. Knowledge that could unravel theological certainty, political stability, or social order was filed away, not destroyed, but entombed in silence. Even more striking were accounts of alternative timelines, chronicles that described events at odds with accepted history, different outcomes to wars, altered successions of rulers, technologies that appeared and vanished without a trace. The Vatican's defense has always been the same. These are forgeries, allegories, or misinterpretations. But forensic analysis has authenticated many of the leaked materials, the parchment, the ink, the Latin phrasing. And their consistency with known historical patterns suggests intent, not invention. Why keep them hidden? Perhaps because some institutions are built not just on what is known, but on what must be believed. If these documents are real, if the Church once held, and perhaps still holds, records of advanced technologies and non-human contact, it would force us to re-examine not only religion, but history itself. What if the keepers of faith were also the keepers of forgotten science? And what if the greatest secret in the Vatican's vaults isn't the knowledge itself, but the reason it was buried. Truth, it seems, is not always suppressed by violence. Sometimes it's hidden with reverence, locked behind belief because belief is safer than understanding. In the frozen corridors of official history, some records are simply too contradictory to survive, but not all are destroyed. Some are quietly denied, reclassified, or simply forgotten. Admiral Richard Byrd's Antarctic Journal may be one of the most controversial of these, but it is not alone. Scattered across the 20th century are explorer logs, private diaries, and field reports that tell of anomalies, geographical impossibilities, civilizations buried under ice, ancient ruins uncovered only to vanish under a veil of secrecy. Many were written by reputable men and women, pilots, scientists, naval officers. Their words were careful, their observations meticulous, and their discoveries, in many cases, officially erased. What these records have in common is the pattern: discovery, classification, silence. They describe fossilized forests in places that should be barren, warm subterranean lakes beneath polar caps, stone structures aligned to celestial events, reports of magnetic anomalies and radar reflections suggesting enormous artificial cavities beneath unbroken ice sheets. Some logs tell of encounters, others of disappearances. Entire expeditions redirected or disbanded, equipment malfunctioning near certain coordinates, aerial surveys altered or lost. In each case, when findings contradicted established models of geology or human history, the response was not investigation, but control. And then came the treaties. Antarctica, once a blank space on maps, suddenly became the most regulated continent on Earth. The Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959, restricted independent exploration. Military activity was banned. Access to certain regions required special permissions. Scientific research became the only officially sanctioned activity, but always under observation. Why such caution for a land of ice? Perhaps because what lies beneath isn't just frozen water, but frozen memory, a record of civilizations, climate shifts, and technologies that rewrite the story of our planet. Geologists know that Antarctica wasn't always icebound. Millions of years ago, it was lush, green, temperate. What if that temperate age was not just prehistoric, but historical? What if human, or post-human, civilizations once thrived there? The explorer logs suggest as much. But suggestion is not confirmation. And so the pages remain in limbo, too detailed to ignore, too disruptive to embrace. The deeper question is not whether these records are true, but why we are so unwilling to consider them. Why must the unknown always be rendered invisible? Maybe it's not the cold or the isolation that defines Antarctica. Maybe it's what we've chosen not to see, and what, even now, we are forbidden to remember. The ancient world was a symphony of stories, but some notes were never meant to reach our ears. In colonial Peru, as Spanish chroniclers documented their conquest, they also recorded fragments of something unexpected. Not just gold, temples, or rebellion, but knowledge, scientific knowledge, technological insight. Records, the Incas claimed, that had been passed down from civilizations long gone. These weren't myths. One chronicler wrote of Inca astronomers who possessed devices, mechanical instruments with rotating gears used to model planetary movements. Others described surgical tools, alloy recipes, and earthquake-resistant engineering that defied European understanding. The Incas credited this wisdom not to their own invention, but to those who came before. Beings who arrived from the sky, taught the laws of the stars, and vanished. What they inherited, they revered. The Incas kept libraries, not of books, but of woven records. Quipus, knotted cords containing data encoded in fiber. While historians once thought them limited to census counts and taxes, new research suggests they held complex narratives, astronomical logs, and perhaps mathematical systems we still haven't decoded. But when the Spanish arrived, they saw heresy in complexity. They burned what they could not understand. Thousands of records, years of observation, of inherited science, vanished in fire. The survivors? They were forced underground. Priests and engineers became laborers and ghosts, their knowledge fading with each forbidden whisper. What remains are ruins, structures so precisely built they continue to withstand earthquakes that level modern buildings. Stones shaped like puzzle pieces, locked together without mortar. Alignments with solstices and equinoxes. Echoes of a language we no longer speak, one built in stone, silence, and sky. Modern archaeologists often focus on culture, art, myth. They rarely speak of technology. To do so is to challenge the timeline, to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, the Incas and those before them understood things we do not. And that frightens us, because if they knew so much, why did it disappear? Perhaps it didn't. Perhaps it was taken. Silenced not by the collapse of civilization, but by conquest. Not by time, but by choice. The question isn't whether the Incas had advanced knowledge. It's whether we're ready to accept that they did, and to ask, what else have we buried, not in the earth, but in the margins of our own history? In those margins, the story still waits, not to be rewritten, but finally read. So where does it all lead? This constellation of forgotten manuscripts, buried machines, lost scrolls, forbidden maps, and whispered contact with civilizations not quite human. If these records are real, even partly real, then our understanding of history is not just incomplete. It's deliberately shaped, not by one shadowy hand, but by centuries of institutions choosing comfort over complexity and control over curiosity. Yet for every manuscript locked away, one survives. For every scroll burned, a fragment remains. For every voice silenced, another begins to ask, what have we missed? The pattern is clear. Knowledge emerges, is documented, and if it does not fit the accepted model, it is erased, denied, or hidden. We've seen it in the Voynich Manuscript, the Sumerian King List, the pyramids of China. In Mayan books that chart the stars with modern precision. In Tesla's notes that could power the planet. In scrolls that spoke of watchers and explorers who found cities beneath the ice. Each alone might be dismissed. Together they form a quiet chorus, not demanding belief, but asking for attention. Maybe the past was not a straight path from ignorance to understanding, but a spiral, rising, falling, forgetting, remembering. Maybe we are not the pinnacle of civilization, but one of its many iterations. This doesn't diminish who we are. It deepens it. Because it means we are part of something far older, stranger, and more beautiful than we've allowed ourselves to imagine. Perhaps the most revolutionary act today is not discovering something new, but daring to look again at what we already have. To question not for the sake of rebellion, but for the sake of truth. What we choose to believe about our past shapes everything, how we learn, how we build, how we dream. And so the final question is not whether these records are real or who tried to hide them. It is this: what will we do now that we've heard their story? Will we turn the page or begin to write a new one? The future, after all, isn't built on certainty. It's built on the courage to wonder.